It was supposed to be just another routine flight. Passengers boarded the plane, a mix of seasoned travelers and families on vacation, all with their stories, their plans, and their expectations. Among them was a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with bright eyes that seemed to carry a quiet intensity. He clung tightly to his backpack as he followed a woman who appeared to be his guardian. She smiled at him occasionally, but something about her movements seemed off. The crew noticed her almost immediately. Cabin crew members are trained to read people. They learn to spot nervous flyers, those who need a little extra reassurance, or those who might cause trouble. But this woman wasn't nervous, and she wasn't fidgety in the usual sense. It was subtle, just enough to set off an internal alarm for one of the flight attendants, Rachel, who had been in the industry long enough to trust her gut. As passengers settled into their seats and the safety demonstration began, Rachel found herself glancing toward the boy. He didn't speak, didn't ask for anything, and avoided eye contact with everyone around him. At first, Rachel dismissed it as shyness, but something nagged at her. His behavior didn't match what she typically saw in children his age. He wasn't curious about the plane, wasn't excited, wasn't anything. He simply sat, staring straight ahead, his small hands gripping the armrests with a rigidity that seemed unnatural. As the flight reached cruising altitude, Rachel and her colleagues began their routine checks, moving through the cabin to ensure passengers were comfortable and attended to. It was then that Rachel noticed the boy's feet. She had to do a double take. For a split second, her brain struggled to process what she was seeing. His shoes didn't fit properly. They were too big, several sizes too big, and worn out in a way that suggested they weren't his. His small ankles were bruised, the kind of bruises that made her stomach drop. It was a detail most people might overlook, but to Rachel, it screamed that something wasn't right. She exchanged a glance with her colleague, Mark, who had also noticed the boy. They didn't speak immediately, but the look they shared said everything. Something about this child's situation was deeply troubling. The woman with him, who had spent most of the flight staring out the window, seemed to notice their attention and shifted uncomfortably. She pulled a blanket over the boy's legs, as if trying to hide them from view. That action alone sent Rachel's instincts into overdrive. After a hushed discussion in the galley, Rachel and Mark decided they couldn't ignore the situation. "I don't know what's going on here," Rachel said quietly, "but we need to do something. We can't just let this slide." Mark nodded in agreement. "But what if we're wrong?" he countered, playing devil's advocate. "We have to be absolutely sure before we escalate this." Rachel hesitated but stood her ground. "Something's not adding up. I'd rather be wrong and look foolish than ignore it and regret it later." The two approached the pilot, Captain Miller, a calm and experienced leader who had faced his fair share of mid-air challenges. They explained their concerns, careful to stick to the facts, but making it clear they believed something was seriously wrong. Captain Miller listened intently, his expression grave. He didn't dismiss their concerns, but he knew the decision to divert a flight was not one to be taken lightly. "We need more information," he said finally. "But if you're right, we're not just talking about an uncomfortable situation. We could be dealing with something far worse." Back in the cabin, Rachel tried to engage the boy in conversation, crouching down to his level and speaking softly. But he remained silent, his eyes darting nervously toward the woman, who was now watching Rachel with a look that could freeze water. The tension in the air was palpable. Rachel's heart raced as she walked away, the weight of her suspicions pressing down on her. She knew time was running out. The crew's next move could determine everything. Captain Miller's voice crackled over the intercom, reassuring passengers that all was well. But behind the scenes, a high-stakes decision was unfolding. Should they risk the complications of an unscheduled landing? Or were they overreacting to a situation that could, in theory, be innocent? The crew knew there was no room for error. With every passing minute, the stakes grew higher. And as Rachel glanced once more at the boy, his haunted eyes seemed to plead for help without uttering a single word. Rachel's mind raced as she tried to piece together what she had just seen. The boy's feet, the ill-fitting shoes, the bruises, they weren't random. Something about the situation was screaming for attention, and every instinct she had told her that ignoring it wasn't an option. But how could they act without knowing for sure? What if they were wrong? Rachel couldn't shake the memory of the woman's icy glare, a look that seemed to warn her to stay out of it. Mark joined Rachel near the galley. "We need more to go on," he said, his voice low but urgent. "The pilot's waiting for us to report back, but I don't think Captain Miller will act without something solid." Rachel nodded, her hands fidgeting with a napkin. "I tried talking to the boy," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder toward the row where he sat today, "but he wouldn't say a word. It's like he's scared of her." Mark frowned. "That's what's bothering me too. He's not just shy, he's terrified. Did you notice how he flinched when she moved her hand earlier? It's subtle, but it's there." Rachel sighed. "And those bruises. Mark, what kid has ankles like that unless they've been restrained or something?" She swallowed hard, the weight of her own words making her stomach churn. Mark leaned in closer. "Okay, so let's think this through. We can't accuse someone without proof, but we also can't ignore what we're seeing. Maybe there's a way to get the boy alone, even for a minute. If we can talk to him without her watching, maybe he'll open up." Rachel's eyes lit up slightly at the suggestion. "Bathroom," she said quickly. "If we can get him to go to the bathroom alone, one of us could talk to him there. It's not much, but it's something." Mark nodded. "Okay, I'll figure out how to suggest it without raising suspicion." As Mark headed back toward the cabin, Rachel stayed behind, her heart pounding. She couldn't stop thinking about the boy's expression, the emptiness in his eyes. It reminded her of a documentary she'd seen about children caught in dangerous situations. Kids who were too scared or too conditioned to ask for help. The thought made her stomach turn, but it also strengthened her resolve. She had to do something. Mark returned a few minutes later, his face tight with frustration. "No luck," he muttered. "I tried casually suggesting it, but the woman wouldn't let him go alone. She got this weird look on her face, like she knew what I was trying to do. She said she'd take him herself if he needed to go." Rachel clenched her fists. "She's hiding something," she whispered. "I can feel it." Meanwhile, Captain Miller had been quietly monitoring the situation from the cockpit. As a seasoned pilot, he'd seen his share of strange occurrences on flights, but this was different. The flight attendants weren't the type to overreact, and their genuine concern was enough to make him uneasy. He checked the flight path and the nearest airports, mentally calculating the time it would take to land if things escalated. Diverting the plane was a last resort, but he knew he had to be ready for anything. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere felt tense, even though most of the passengers were oblivious to what was happening. Rachel couldn't help but notice the way the woman was now sitting, stiff, her body angled slightly toward the boy, as if shielding him from view. Every so often, she would glance around the cabin, her eyes darting from one crew member to another. It was as if she was waiting for someone to make a move. Rachel decided to take a different approach. She walked over to the row where the woman and the boy were seated, her expression calm and friendly. "Hi there," she said, her tone light. "Can I get you anything? Water? A snack?" The woman shook her head quickly, barely looking at her. "No, we're fine," she said curtly. Rachel turned her attention to the boy. "And you, sweetheart? Are you okay? Do you need anything?" The boy hesitated, his eyes flicking to the woman. She gave him a sharp look, and he immediately shook his head. "No, thank you," he mumbled, his voice so soft it was almost inaudible. Rachel felt a pang in her chest. "Well, if you change your mind, just let me know," she said, forcing a smile before walking away. In the galley, Rachel and Mark regrouped, their frustration growing. "She's not going to let him out of her sight," Rachel said, her voice trembling slightly. "And he's too scared to say anything with her there." Mark ran a hand through his hair. "We need to decide what to do," he said. "If we're going to act, we have to act soon." The crew decided to keep a close eye on the pair while they considered their next move. As the flight continued, Rachel couldn't help but notice more unsettling details. The woman's grip on the boy's arm when she thought no one was watching. The way the boy avoided even the slightest interaction with other passengers. The way the woman tensed every time a crew member walked by. Finally, Rachel couldn't take it anymore. She approached Captain Miller once again, this time with Mark by her side. "Captain," she said firmly, "I know this isn't an easy decision, but I really think we need to act. That boy is terrified, and I don't think we can afford to wait. If we're wrong, we're wrong. But if we're right..." Captain Miller studied their faces, his own expression unreadable. After a long pause, he nodded. "Okay," he said. "Let's do this. I'll make the announcement and start preparing for an emergency landing. In the meantime, keep watching them. If anything changes, let me know immediately." Rachel felt a surge of relief mixed with anxiety. They were taking a risk, but it was a risk she was willing to take. As Captain Miller began coordinating with air traffic control, Rachel and Mark returned to the cabin, their eyes trained on the woman and the boy. Rachel noticed the woman's body language shift almost instantly. She was watching them now, her eyes narrowing as if she could sense that something was about to happen. The tension in the cabin was almost unbearable as the plane began its descent. Passengers looked around, confused, as Captain Miller announced that they were making an unscheduled landing due to a technical issue. Rachel's heart pounded as she saw the woman lean toward the boy, whispering something in his ear. Whatever she said made him visibly tense, his small hands clutching the armrests once again. As the ground grew closer, Rachel couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. Whatever was happening here, they were about to find out, and she could only hope they were making the right decision. The plane descended steadily, the hum of the engines slightly lower than usual. Rachel moved through the cabin, her professional demeanor masking the turmoil inside. Passengers glanced at her curiously, some asking casual questions about the unexpected landing. She reassured them with practiced ease, though her thoughts were anything but calm. Every step closer to the woman and the boy felt heavier. The woman's eyes followed her every move, sharp and calculating. Mark stayed near the galley, pretending to organize items but watching intently. He'd always been the calm one in tough situations, but now even he seemed on edge. He glanced at Rachel as she passed and gave her a subtle nod. They were on the same page. Stay close, but not too obvious. It was a delicate balance, enough to monitor without alerting the woman that she was under suspicion. Rachel caught another glimpse of the boy. His small frame was rigid in the seat, his hands clenched tightly on his lap. He stared straight ahead, avoiding everyone's gaze. For a brief moment, their eyes met. She tried to convey warmth, safety, anything that might reassure him, but his gaze flickered back down almost instantly. She wondered what kind of fear could silence a child so completely. Meanwhile, Captain Miller coordinated with air traffic control. The nearest airport was already preparing for their unscheduled landing. Emergency responders were being notified, just in case the situation turned out to be what the crew feared. In the cockpit, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Miller's co-pilot, a younger man named Ethan, had been briefed on the situation. "You think it's serious?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Miller sighed. "I don't know, but I trust my crew. If they think something's wrong, we can't ignore it." Back in the cabin, Rachel noticed another strange detail. The woman had been fiddling with her phone, glancing at the screen frequently and typing something with quick, almost frantic movements. It wasn't unusual for passengers to use their phones, but her behavior seemed different. She wasn't scrolling or reading. She was messaging, short, urgent bursts. Rachel made a mental note of it, her instincts kicking into overdrive. Who was she talking to, and why did it feel so secretive? As the plane neared the airport, the woman's tension became more visible. She shifted in her seat, her eyes darting around the cabin as if calculating her options. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was planning something. Mark seemed to notice it too. He whispered to Rachel as they crossed paths. "She's getting antsy," he said. "We need to be ready for anything when we land." The minutes stretched on, every second thick with tension. The passengers were still largely unaware of what was happening, but a few had started to sense the unease among the crew. Rachel overheard snippets of whispered conversations, speculation about the landing, curiosity about the unusual vibe. She ignored them, her focus locked on the boy and the woman. As the plane touched down, Rachel felt a wave of relief mixed with apprehension. They were one step closer to uncovering the truth. But what would happen now? Would the woman try to escape? Would she fight back? Rachel glanced at Mark, who gave her a reassuring nod. Whatever was about to happen, they were ready to handle it. The plane taxied to a remote area of the tarmac, away from the main terminal. Emergency vehicles were already waiting, their lights flashing but sirens silent. Captain Miller made an announcement, his voice calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We've made an unscheduled landing due to a technical issue, and we'll be assisting everyone off the plane shortly. Please remain seated until further instructions." Rachel and Mark moved to the front of the cabin as the ground crew approached. An airport security officer stepped on board, his expression serious. Rachel quickly briefed him on the situation, explaining their concerns about the boy and the woman. The officer listened carefully, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. "We'll handle it," he said firmly. "Stay with the passengers and keep everything as calm as possible." As the passengers began to disembark, Rachel watched the woman and the boy closely. The woman clutched the boy's hand tightly, her knuckles white. She tried to act casual, but her tension was palpable. When it was their turn to leave, the security officer subtly signaled for them to step aside. "Ma'am, we need to ask you a few questions," he said, his tone polite but firm. The woman froze, her face a mask of confusion and indignation. "What is this about?" she demanded, her voice sharp. The officer remained calm. "Just routine, ma'am. Please come with us." The boy glanced at Rachel as they were led away, his eyes wide and filled with something that looked like a mix of fear and hope. It was a look Rachel would never forget. Once the woman and the boy were off the plane, Rachel and Mark exchanged a glance. They'd done everything they could. Now it was in the hands of the authorities. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever the truth was, it was about to come to light, and it wasn't going to be pretty. Rachel paced near the plane's exit, her mind racing with questions she couldn't yet answer. The boy's face, the bruises, the way he seemed to shrink into himself. It was all burned into her memory. She couldn't help but replay every moment, wondering if they had done enough or if they had acted too late. Mark stood beside her, arms crossed tightly, his usual calm replaced with a rare tension. Neither of them spoke much. The weight of what was happening outside the plane was almost too much to put into words. Through the cabin windows, Rachel could see the woman and the boy on the tarmac, surrounded by airport security and plainclothes officers who had arrived moments after the plane landed. The woman was speaking quickly, her arms gesturing wildly as she tried to maintain control of the situation. The boy, on the other hand, stood perfectly still, his head down and his shoulders hunched. Rachel's stomach churned as she watched him. Every fiber of her being wanted to rush out there and shield him, to tell him it was going to be okay, even if she wasn't sure it would be. Passengers began murmuring louder, their curiosity growing as they realized this was more than a routine delay. A middle-aged man in a business suit leaned toward Rachel as she passed. "What's going on out there?" he asked, his tone more annoyed than concerned. Rachel smiled tightly, her response rehearsed but genuine. "Just a precaution, sir. Thank you for your patience." She moved on before he could press further. The last thing she needed was a cabin full of restless passengers asking questions she wasn't allowed to answer. Mark nudged her gently, nodding toward the front of the plane where Captain Miller had just emerged from the cockpit. "Any updates?" he asked. The captain shook his head, his expression grim. "Not yet. They're still questioning her. From what I've heard, she's claiming to be his mother, but her story's full of holes." He paused, glancing toward the window. "And the boy? Did he say anything?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miller shook his head again. "Not yet. He hasn't spoken a word to them." Rachel felt her heart sink. What if the boy was too scared to speak? What if he had been silenced for so long that he didn't know how to trust anyone anymore? The thought made her throat tighten, but she pushed the emotion down. This wasn't the time to let her feelings take over. She needed to stay focused, to see this through. Outside, the questioning continued. The woman's voice grew louder, her tone shifting between anger and desperation. Rachel caught fragments of her words through the thick cabin walls. "This is a misunderstanding. He's my son. You're making a mistake." But the officers didn't seem convinced. One of them crouched down to speak to the boy, his tone gentle and patient. Rachel couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could see the way the boy's hands trembled at his sides. He looked up at the officer, his lips moving slightly, but whatever he said was lost to the distance. Mark, who had been watching just as intently, leaned closer to Rachel. "Do you think he'll talk?" he asked quietly. Rachel hesitated, her gaze fixed on the scene outside. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I hope so. He's the only one who knows the truth." She glanced at Mark, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. "And if he doesn't, we still did the right thing. We gave him a chance." The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. More officers arrived, including someone who appeared to be a child welfare worker. Rachel watched as they approached the boy, speaking softly to him while keeping a cautious distance from the woman. She noticed the way the woman's expression shifted, anger giving way to something more dangerous. Fear. It was the first time she looked genuinely afraid, and that only deepened Rachel's suspicion that they were onto something. Suddenly, the boy took a small step forward, away from the woman. It was so subtle that Rachel almost missed it, but it was enough to make her heart skip a beat. The officers noticed too, their body language shifting slightly, as if readying themselves for whatever might come next. The woman reacted instantly, her voice rising in pitch as she called out to him. "Don't go anywhere, sweetheart. Stay right here with Mommy." Her words were sugary sweet, but her tone was laced with an edge that sent a chill down Rachel's spine. The boy froze, his small frame visibly shaking. For a moment, it seemed like he might retreat, but then something shifted. Rachel couldn't explain it, but there was a flicker of determination in his posture, a tiny spark of courage breaking through the fear. He took another step forward, this time more deliberate, and spoke. His voice was faint, barely audible even to those standing closest to him, but whatever he said made the officers spring into action. Rachel pressed her hands against the window, straining to see what was happening. The woman's calm facade shattered in an instant. She lunged toward the boy, her hands outstretched, but the officers were faster. Two of them intercepted her, pulling her back as she screamed in protest. The boy flinched but didn't move, standing frozen as the chaos unfolded around him. Rachel's heart raced as she watched the scene, her pulse pounding in her ears. She turned to Mark, her voice trembling. "What did he say? Did you see what he said?" Mark shook his head, his eyes wide. "No, but whatever it was, it changed everything." As the officers restrained the woman and led her away from the boy, Rachel felt a wave of relief mixed with unease. The boy was safe for now, but the truth, the full, unfiltered truth, was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And whatever it was, she had a sinking feeling that it was darker than she could have imagined. Rachel leaned against the cabin wall, her hands gripping the edge of the service counter as she tried to steady herself. What she had just witnessed left her shaken, but there was no time to process it. The boy was safe for now, but something about the woman's reaction lingered in her mind. The way she'd fought against the officers, the desperate edge to her screams. It didn't feel like the behavior of someone merely caught in a lie. It felt like there was something bigger she was trying to protect. Mark placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder, his own expression etched with concern. "You okay?" he asked softly. Rachel nodded, though the tension in her chest hadn't eased. "I think so," she said, her voice quiet. "But I can't shake this feeling. There's more to this, Mark." She wasn't just angry, she was terrified. Mark hesitated, then nodded. "I noticed that too. She's hiding something, and whatever it is, it's not small." Outside, the boy was being escorted toward one of the waiting vehicles. A child welfare worker walked beside him, speaking gently as they guided him away from the chaos. Rachel could see the boy's face more clearly now, and it struck her how young he looked. He couldn't have been older than 8, yet his expression held a heaviness far beyond his years. She wondered what kind of life could leave a child looking so haunted. Before the car door closed, the boy glanced back toward the plane. For a moment, Rachel thought he was looking at her, and her breath caught in her throat. His eyes were wide and pleading, as if trying to communicate something he couldn't say out loud. Then he was gone, the car pulling away with the boy safely inside. Rachel turned back to Mark. "I want to know what he said to them," she said firmly. Mark nodded in agreement. "Me too. Let's see if Captain Miller can find out. He's still in touch with the ground team." They found the captain in the cockpit, his headset on as he spoke to someone on the ground. His expression was serious, and he motioned for them to wait. When he finished the call, he turned to Rachel and Mark, his brow furrowed. "I just got an update," he said. "The boy told them she's not his mother. He said she took him from a park near his home. Apparently, he's been missing for 3 days. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth, the weight of the revelation hitting her like a punch to the stomach. 3 days, she repeated, her voice trembling. That poor child, Mark's jaw tightened. So she's a kidnapper, he said grimly. That explains the bruises, the way he was so afraid of her. But why? Why take him? Captain Miller hesitated, his gaze shifting between the two of them. There's more, he said finally. They ran a check on her while they were questioning her. She's not who she claimed to be. He paused, his voice dropping lower. She's connected to a larger investigation, a trafficking ring they've been trying to crack for months. Rachel felt the air leave her lungs. Her mind reeled at the thought of how close they had come to letting the woman disappear into the crowd after landing. Trafficking? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Captain Miller nodded. That's why she was so desperate. She knows if they dig deeper, they'll uncover everything. Mark swore under his breath, running a hand through his hair. This just got a lot bigger, he muttered. Rachel nodded, her thoughts racing. The woman wasn't just someone who had made a terrible decision. She was part of something much darker, something that had likely hurt countless children like the boy they'd just saved. As the gravity of the situation settled over them, a commotion outside caught their attention. Through the cabin windows, Rachel saw the woman being escorted toward a police vehicle. She was shouting, her voice sharp and panicked, but it wasn't the words that made Rachel's blood run cold. It was the way she was looking around, scanning the tarmac as if she were searching for something or someone. Rachel's stomach turned as a chilling thought crossed her mind. What if she wasn't working alone? What if someone else was on the plane, watching everything unfold and waiting for the right moment to act? She turned to Mark, her voice urgent. What if there's someone else involved? What if she's not the only one? Mark's eyes widened, and he immediately turned toward the cabin. We need to check, he said, his voice tense. Rachel followed him as they moved quickly down the aisle, scanning the faces of the remaining passengers. Most of them looked confused or impatient, still waiting for instructions to disembark. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that someone among them didn't belong. Her heart raced as she spotted a man sitting near the back of the plane, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. He was hunched over, his hands gripping his phone tightly as he typed furiously. Something about his body language set off alarm bells in her mind. She nudged Mark, nodding toward the man. Look, she whispered. Does he seem off to you? Mark frowned, watching the man closely. He's definitely nervous, he murmured. Let's notify security. If he's connected to her, we need to act fast. Rachel's pulse quickened as Mark signaled to the ground crew. The stakes had just been raised, and the outcome of this story was more uncertain than ever. Rachel's heart pounded as she watched Mark signal the ground crew, their movements suddenly sharp and purposeful. The man in the baseball cap, oblivious to the attention he had drawn, continued typing on his phone, his shoulders tense. Rachel glanced around the cabin, searching for any signs that someone else might be involved. Every passenger now felt like a potential piece of the puzzle, and the weight of responsibility pressed harder with each second. 2 plainclothes officers quietly boarded the plane, moving toward the back row where the man was seated. Rachel and Mark stayed close, watching as the officers approached him. When they stopped beside his seat, the man froze. His fingers hovered over his phone for a moment before he slowly looked up at them, his face carefully blank. Sir, we need you to come with us, one of the officers said, his voice firm but calm. The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the emergency exit. Rachel's breath caught. Was he actually considering trying to escape? But before he could move, the officers stepped closer, their presence making it clear that running wasn't an option. I don't know what this is about, the man said, his voice low and steady. But Rachel noticed the faint tremor in his hands as he set his phone down on the tray table. One of the officers gestured for him to stand, and after a long pause, he complied. As he was escorted off the plane, Rachel caught a glimpse of his phone screen. A message thread was open, the last message reading, "She's been taken. What are the next steps?" Rachel's stomach dropped. The message wasn't sent yet, but it was chillingly clear what it meant. She exchanged a look with Mark, who had seen it too. "He's part of it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark nodded, his expression grim. No doubt about it. Outside the plane, the man was questioned near the police vehicles while the woman, now handcuffed, sat in one of the cars. Rachel watched as the man's demeanor shifted, his initial calm cracking under the weight of the officer's questions. He gestured toward the woman at one point, clearly agitated. Rachel couldn't hear the exchange, but it was obvious that his connection to her was deeper than he wanted to admit. Then, just as it seemed the pieces were falling into place, the boy's car returned to the scene. Rachel frowned, confused. The child welfare worker stepped out first, her face pale and serious. She opened the back door, and the boy climbed out slowly. He clung to her side, his small hand gripping hers tightly. His wide eyes scanned the tarmac until they landed on Rachel through the cabin window. For the second time that day, Rachel felt a strange pull in her chest, as if he were trying to tell her something without words. Before Rachel could process what was happening, the boy broke away from the welfare worker and ran toward the man in the baseball cap. "Stop him!" Rachel shouted instinctively, bolting for the plane's exit. But the officers didn't need her warning. They were already moving to intercept the boy. One of them gently caught him, kneeling to his level and speaking softly to calm him down. The boy pointed toward the man, his voice rising in desperation. "He's not the bad one," the boy cried. "It's her. She made him do it. She said she'd hurt his family if he didn't help." His words came out in a tumble, each one hitting Rachel like a brick. The officers exchanged stunned glances before looking back at the man, who now seemed more defeated than defiant. Rachel stopped in her tracks, the weight of the revelation sinking in. The man wasn't the ringleader. He was another pawn in the woman's twisted scheme. The officers quickly shifted their focus, turning back to the woman in the police car. Her calm demeanor had crumbled completely now, replaced by a feral, cornered animal look. She screamed obscenities at the boy, the man, and the officers, but her words fell on deaf ears. It was over. Rachel and Mark stood on the tarmac, watching as the pieces of the mystery finally came together. The woman's operation had been larger and more insidious than they could have imagined, but her attempt to flee had unraveled it all. The boy's courage to speak up, not just once but twice, had made the difference. And the man, despite his initial complicity, had been coerced into a role he never wanted. As the boy was gently led back to the welfare worker, he turned to Rachel one last time. This time, his gaze was steady, and there was a flicker of something she hadn't seen before: hope. Rachel smiled softly, giving him a small nod. Whatever came next for him, she knew he was on the path to safety now. Mark broke the silence beside her. "That was something," he said, exhaling deeply. Rachel nodded, her mind still racing. "It's not every day you save a life," she said quietly. "Or two." The plane's engines hummed in the background as they prepared for takeoff again. The passengers had been remarkably patient, their confusion turning into quiet admiration as the story spread through the cabin. Rachel and Mark returned to their stations, the adrenaline slowly fading, but the weight of what had happened lingering in their hearts. As the plane ascended into the sky, Rachel glanced out the window, her thoughts returning to the boy. She didn't know what the future held for him, but she hoped he would find the peace and safety he deserved. One thing was certain: she would never forget him, or the way his quiet courage had changed everything. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, the hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady rhythm that felt oddly soothing after the chaos on the ground. Rachel and Mark worked quietly, moving up and down the aisle, checking on passengers who had questions or needed reassurance. Most of the travelers, though curious about the unusual delay, seemed content now that the flight was back on course. But Rachel couldn't shake the images from earlier. The boy's trembling hands, the desperation in his eyes, and the way his courage had turned the tide. She thought about everything that had unfolded in just a few hours. From the strange tension in the cabin to the emergency landing, to the unraveling of a case far more sinister than she could have anticipated. It felt surreal. Yet, despite the gravity of it all, there was a sense of relief. They had done the right thing. Mark approached her as she stood by the galley, staring out at the endless expanse of clouds. "You okay?" he asked, handing her a cup of water. Rachel nodded, though her thoughts were still far away. Yeah, just processing, she admitted. It's hard to believe we were part of something like that. Mark leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. I keep thinking about the boy, he said. How brave he was. He could have stayed quiet, but he didn't. That kid might have saved a lot of lives today. Rachel nodded. And what about the man? She asked. He was part of it, sure, but you saw how scared he was. I think he was trapped too, just like the boy. Maybe he'll get a second chance. Mark tilted his head, considering her words. Let's hope so. But the important thing is that they're both out of danger now. The intercom crackled as Captain Miller's voice came on. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your patience earlier. We're now cruising at 35,000 feet and should arrive at our destination on time. We appreciate your understanding and cooperation during today's events. His tone was calm and professional, but Rachel could sense the weight behind his words. Everyone on board had played a role, whether they realized it or not. As the flight continued, Rachel noticed passengers smiling at her as she passed. Some even whispered their gratitude for how the crew had handled the situation. A young woman in a window seat stopped Rachel as she poured coffee. I don't know what happened exactly, she said softly, but I could tell it was serious. Thank you for keeping us safe. Rachel smiled, the warmth in the woman's words easing some of the heaviness she'd been carrying. Thank you, she replied. We just did what we had to do. Hours later, when the plane finally touched down at their destination, the passengers disembarked, offering kind words to the crew as they left. Rachel stood by the door, exchanging smiles and farewells, though her mind was still replaying everything that had happened. When the last passenger stepped off, she let out a long breath, leaning against the frame. Mark joined her, his bag slung over one shoulder. Well, he said, that was a flight we'll never forget. Rachel chuckled softly, though the exhaustion in her voice was clear. You can say that again. As they exited the plane, the airport felt strangely normal. Travelers rushing to catch connecting flights, announcements echoing over the PA system. It was hard to reconcile the ordinary bustle with the extraordinary events they had just been part of. Before leaving, Rachel checked her phone and found a text from one of the ground crew members. It was a brief update about the boy. He's safe now, in protective care. The authorities are confident they've got what they need to bring down the entire ring. Thank you for what you did. The words brought a wave of emotion crashing over her. She stared at the screen for a long moment before showing it to Mark. That's all I needed to hear, he said, smiling faintly. Rachel nodded, tucking her phone away. Me too. In the days that followed, the story made headlines. News outlets reported on the flight crew who helped uncover a human trafficking operation, praising their vigilance and quick thinking. Rachel found herself scrolling through articles, piecing together details about the woman, the man, and the boy. The woman had been the key to dismantling a network that had eluded authorities for years. The man, while complicit in some ways, had been coerced under threats to his family. And the boy, he was finally reunited with his parents, who had been searching for him tirelessly since his disappearance. Rachel never met the boy again, but she thought about him often. She wondered how he was healing, how his family was helping him rebuild his life. She hoped he would grow up knowing that his courage had changed everything, not just for himself, but for so many others. One evening, as she sat on her porch with a cup of tea, Rachel received an email from the airline. It was a thank you note, recognizing her and the rest of the crew for their exceptional service during the incident. Attached was a photo of a handwritten note from the boy's parents. The words were simple but powerful. Thank you for saving our son. We'll never forget you. Tears welled in Rachel's eyes as she read the message. She folded her hands over the mug, letting its warmth seep into her skin. In her line of work, she had always known that she carried a responsibility, not just to get people to their destinations safely, but to look out for them, to see them. That day, she had done more than she ever imagined she would. Life returned to its usual rhythm, but Rachel was forever changed by the experience. She continued to fly, each journey a reminder of how quickly things could shift, how vital it was to stay present and vigilant. She didn't need the headlines or the recognition. The real reward was knowing they had made a difference, that they had given a little boy a chance at a new beginning. As she prepared for her next flight, Rachel stood in the crew briefing room, listening to the captain outline the day's schedule. When he finished, she exchanged a glance with Mark, who gave her a small, knowing smile. They didn't need to say anything. They both understood that the work they did mattered in ways they couldn't always predict. The call for boarding came over the intercom, and Rachel took her place at the gate, welcoming passengers with a warm smile. As she scanned their tickets and answered their questions, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life she led. It wasn't always easy, but it was always meaningful. And that was enough.